like to continue these series of videos in our ongoing group reading of Nick Land's collection of essays, Fanged, Noumena. In this fourth lecture, we will move on to the very difficult essay titled Art as Insurrection, the question of aesthetics in Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. This essay is in itself excessively dense and terse, but of course is a lot of fun to go through for just that reason. Now, this is really, I think, an essay which talks about art in terms of a progression from Kant's view on the subject matter to that of Schopenhauer to Nietzsche, and then finally it ends with Freud, with a reference to Socrates, really as the point where things originally went wrong with regard to the West's relation to the aesthetic on a philosophical level. But in addition to being about art, this is really, I think, in a roundabout way, an essay on Nick Land's views on the kind of flashpoints, as you might call them, where the acceleration of intensive power might be pushed to the point of a certain singularity, where the laws of capital, for example, come to be suspended as the natural but very crucially non-dialectical outcome of the self-development of capital itself. Now, you might be surprised to learn that the name for one of these such accelerationist flashpoints is actually just art itself, or more broadly the aesthetic, but only if by that term you mean the exact opposite of what entertainment has become under the influence of modern technology. Now, very humorously, Nick Land opens the essay with a quote from none other than himself. He opens with a quote calling artists, quote-unquote, those savage beasts that can't get enough of too much. Already here, before the essay proper has begun, we have two very important accusations, each of which will be fleshed out over the remainder of the essay. First of all, we have the claim that artists are quite literally wild animals. If you look at the etymology for the word savage, well, to this day in the French language, sauvage simply is the word for wild, and really the etymology within Latin has to do with the forest. If you look at Dante's Divine Comedy, the first canto uses both Italian words selva, which is the wood or forest, and selvaggia, which is wild, because that poem opens in the dark wood, which is kind of a metaphorical reference to the material cause of Aristotle, because Aristotle himself simply used the ordinary Greek term wood to talk about material, because there was no technical term for that before Aristotle himself basically invented it. So rather than pull himself up by his own bootstraps, he basically had to creatively repurpose words which really do communicate what he's trying to get at, because the same wood can be formed into different pieces of furniture by a skilled carpenter, and in that case the only difference is the form that each one has. They're quite literally made of the same wood or the same matter. And for Dante also, the poet awakes in the middle of the path, as he says, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, the middle of the path of our life, in a state where he's kind of half-conscious because he's still stuck in the materiality of the wood, but he's also literally within the wood of a dark forest. And it's within that wood that he sees, on a theoretical level with his own eyes, a path out of that darkness up to a hill on an elevated position where the light is shining, but the path is blocked by three wild animals. So we have selva and selvaggia occurring in the first canto of Dante's Divine Comedy, because there was a more literal sense in pre-modern times that something is wild because it lives in the forest. You might be surprised to know that the word deer in modern American English might refer to one specific, maybe, species of animal that lives in the woods. You know, it's the thing with the big antlers. Bambi is an instance of this species, but the word deer is suspiciously etymologically similar to the word for all animals within German, which is Tiere. Well, the fact is that the word deer in English used to refer to all wild animals in the very specific sense of all animals that live in the forest. The forest is that which is beyond the limits of the village, beyond human civilization, and that's where you find that which is selvaggia, because it's quite literally la selva. By designating artists savage beasts, Land seems to suggest that they are precisely those kind of animals which also inhabit the modern-day metaphorical selva, or forest, which is really defined negatively negatively as that which is beyond the limits of the modern day village. Well, if you look at the anti-technological thought of someone like Jacques Ellul or Ted Kaczynski, it's clear that the modern-day village is just the system of modern technology. So the aesthetic gives us something beyond the rationalization of modern technology. We keep in mind that for Jacques Ellul, technology is not simply a bundle of physical machines, for those machines can only come to be instantiated physically if some system of artificial rationalization had already been presupposed, not only to provide the know-how for them to be constructed, but more importantly, to designate a position for them within the broader system which allowed them to exist in the first place. There is no such thing for Jacques Ellul as a machine in the singular, for there's always a network which is collectively unified for the common goal of maximizing the efficiency, productivity, and predictability of the whole system. So anything beyond that rationalization is indeed a problem from the standpoint of the technological system, but is something of a flashpoint where an acceleration of the intensity of that power could be used to push that system of rationalization to the point of a certain singularity, where its own rules come to be suspended. And therefore, what the aesthetic represents as being wild is something which is maybe below rationality if you look at the Kantian architecture of subjectivity, as Nick Land does explicitly within this essay. He says that the animality which this represents is something which reason punishes us for through things like the sublime. Reason, as we'll see later, punishes the imagination for failing to do the impossible and failing to schematize that which is excessively large. But the deeper point of this feud between reason and imagination is really that it's punishing us for remaining animal all too animal. But the kind of excess which is entailed by just that fact, well, that is, I think, a site of productive potential precisely for the project of acceleration. For this reason, the second half of that quote, calling artists those who can't get enough of too much, is exactly related to this idea that art is always an excess. It's not that you have the moderate form of art and then you push that too far to get too much. No, it's always too much, and yet they can't get enough of it despite that fact. So this begs the question, what exactly is it that art is too much of, and what exactly is it that it is beyond the limits of if it is an excess or a surplus? That presupposes something is standing on the outside of. We'll really have to go through the whole essay to find that out. But Nick Land actually answers the second one of those questions first by immediately designating Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, as the crucial site where art, quote-unquote, erupts into philosophy with the force of a trauma. This clarifies really that Kant's understanding of beauty and genius tell us something about what exactly it is that art is an excess of or an excess beyond. For a very quick review, Kant's critique of judgment had theorized that the experience of art, or the experience of beauty in general, differs from ordinary experience in that whereas we usually use what he calls determinative judgments, which tell us what something is because we have the concept readily available and then we subsume the experience under it. For example, I see a monkey on the side of the road here in India. I know what that thing is because I have the linguistic, ultimately, notion of a monkey available, and I simply subsume it under that experience and go along my way. In art, however, things are different because the concept is missing, because we quite literally don't know what we are seeing or hearing when we do something like listen to the music of Mozart. We see a painting of Van Gogh, we read the poetry of somebody like Wallace Stevens, but it's precisely because we do not have a universal concept which would pull the handbrake on the whole experience that our subjective faculties are allowed within that gap to launch into a harmonious free play. And it is exactly this free play which causes us to feel the aesthetic pleasure which comes to be associated with great art. Because of its reflective rather than determinative character, aesthetic experience is something which, once again, we literally do not understand, but that's the entire point. In fact, it's not just we the viewers or appreciators of art. It's even the artist himself or herself who does not understand his or her own works, despite the fact that they created them. And even if you come to ask them in an interview about how exactly it is that they create these, they can't provide a rational explanation for it. Only the mysterious idea of genius can explain this, says Kant, or the idea that a certain number of people in history just happen to have been born with the talent of someone like a Mozart, a Van Gogh, or a Honoré de Balzac. Likewise, we have two very different excesses beyond what can be accounted for by the rational structures of explanation. Kant suggests both the beauty of the work of art and the genius of the artist who produced it are these types of intensive flashpoints in which you have a power which exceeds the limits of the transcendent structure of conceptual explicability or of rationalization. Now, to return to Nick Land's essay, he notes that even before the third critique, if you really think about it, Kant had already discovered a certain kind of excess which had already gone beyond the kind of rational structures of explanation which he had inherited from the Western philosophical tradition. If you really think about it, synthetic a priori judgments already disrupt the coordinates of what would have passed as quote-unquote a priori knowledge before Kant's time. Before Kant, a priori knowledge was basically just another word for a tautology which is valid for simply the negative reason of not violating the law of non-contradiction. In other words, an a priori judgment before Kant is something which simply paraphrases the same meaning twice. For example, the claim all unmarried men are bachelors or all bodies are extended. Well, both of those are just saying the same thing with different symbols. Synthetic a priori knowledge differs from this, however, in that both sides of the statement do not simply paraphrase one another with superficially different signifiers. Instead, truths of arithmetic and geometry are paradoxically both already known because they were never derived from experience, yet new at the same time, because you need the help of a certain intuition, albeit a purified one, to present these truths. An analysis of the meaning of concepts is simply not enough to tell you, for example, that 12 is the sum of 5 and 7. For no matter how much you analyze 5 and 7, you'll never be able to derive 12 from them simply through the negative means of not violating the law of non-contradiction. Similarly, within geometry, you need a certain purified intuition of space similar to the purified intuition of time that takes you from 5 and 7 to 12 to show you, in the case of geometry, that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. For Kant, the synthetic a priori therefore allows you to examine a perverse pseudo-object, we might say, called the conditions of experience as such. This is something which, in the earlier essay Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, Nick Land noted are something which tells you about experience despite the fact that it is never actually experienced in and of itself. Therefore, in that same essay, Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, Nick Land noted that these conditions of experience are actually a lot like money under capitalism. In both cases, you have a generic form which tells you in advance how you are supposed to deal with any generic new object, no matter what it might happen to be. In fact, you don't have to know what that new object is to know that these forms of exchange will be applicable to it. Just as money allows you to exchange any commodity on the market, whatever it might be, the Kantian conditions of experience allow experienced contents to be marketed to the mind through the common denominators of things like space, time, category, etc. In the essay Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, Nick Land, however, identified Amazonian feminists as a certain flashpoint at which the structures of capital might be exploded from within simply through accelerating an intensity which was already there to begin with. So too in this essay, Nick Land suggests that the excess which could explode the predetermined forms of the rationalized conditions of experience from within is just the aesthetic excess of art, which is not predetermined by any universally intelligible concept. Nick Land goes on to note that the real point of Kant, therefore, is simply his revelation of the impossibility of maintaining the kind of rationalist metaphysics you find preserved even as late as Leibniz into modernity. You might recall that Leibniz was a quote-unquote pure rationalist in the sense that, according to him, just as one can know everything one needs to know about a triangle through reason rather than through empirical experience, supposedly one could extend that method beyond the realm of abstract mathematical objects to understand the essence of all real physical objects, too. This is something which maybe made sense on the presumption that every one of those objects had been intentionally created as a piece to fit in the best of all possible worlds, but Nick Land showed that this sort of Leibnizian rationalism, in which all essences might be known on purely a priori grounds, missed the point that in this context, a priori is just another word for tautological. This kind of tautological knowledge takes for granted that positivity is always given in advance, says Nick Land, because it maintains the scholastic metaphysics of the Middle Ages into modernity. Under that view, God, of course, is that which is always already given as positivity because he was the creator of all. When you get to the kind of synthetic a priori of Kant, you find something far more disruptive and revolutionary than that from within the a priori itself, because this is the way that reason itself finds openness to that which is genuinely new. Because of Leibniz's reliance on the scholastic ideal that positivity can be given in advance because the full positivity of God as the creator of the universe had always already been, it's really a question of one's relation to time that separates the Leibnizian metaphysics from the critique of Kant. And this is exactly what is of interest in the philosophy of acceleration, because real time basically must be an openness to the future, whereas the false or spurious time simply reduplicates the past into a type of pseudo-substantiality in the present which cannot ever be called into question. If you really think about it, Kant's philosophy and Capital are both alike in the precise temporal sense that both of them give us destabilizing loops into the newness of an actually open future. Capital does this through constantly scrambling its own limits in the kind of self-revolutionization which Zizek has repeatedly emphasized. These therefore differ from the metaphysics of Leibniz or scholastic philosophy in that those have a relation to time which simply reinstantiates the past in a redundant manner through the illusion of a type of pre-given substantiality. This, though, really is just nihilism, or saying no to the will to power in disguise, whereas Kant's philosophy in Capital, under the right conditions, can actually give you the kind of affirmation which Nietzsche had also associated with art, as we will see just a little later within this essay. Now, with this framework established, Nick Land notes that, in retrospect, Kant only found that he needed to write the third critique after he had discovered a certain problem remaining even after the Herculean task of describing the way that the understanding can legislate for nature had been accomplished. If you really think about it, on a Kantian level, if you look up at the sky at night, you can fit the entire universe inside of your own mind. But even for limits as widely encompassing as those, you can still see a certain excess exceeding what they had legislated for in the problem of natural beauty itself. And this is ultimately what led Kant to have to write the third critique. But while we are on the subject of the aesthetic as it appears within nature, it's not just beauty, but also the sublime, which leads us to understand why exactly it is the case that reason punishes the imagination, not only for failing to do the impossible, in that the sublime is that which is by definition so large that the imagination cannot schematize it, that the deeper point of this feud between imagination and reason has to do, Nick Land now tells us, with the reason punishing the imagination for being exactly what it is supposed to be, which is preconceptual. The first time that you read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you might be maybe misled to think that Kant's admission of the empiricist side of things, that sense data impinge on our senses from the outside, and then this is later used to synthesize the kind of experience we take for granted. You might be misled to think that it's the sense contents themselves which impinge on the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, etc., which are directly subsumed under the concepts of the understanding. But actually, that is not the case. Kant noted that sense data and linguistic concepts are so different from one another, kind of like comparing apples and oranges, that the sense data have to first pass through a certain intermediary structure in which they're mysteriously transformed into proto-concepts, and it's those proto-concepts from the imagination which are actually subsumed under the concepts. Now, by punishing the imagination, reason is not only calling it out for failing once again to do the impossible, it is also venting its rage at the imagination for being exactly what it is, which is below the understanding. And really what reason does in punishing it in the experience of the sublime, in which rather than the pleasure of beauty, you actually have a certain pain within the experience of the sublime, which accounts for its aesthetic character. Keep in mind, aesthetic literally just means something like feeling. Okay, it's in the experience of the sublime that reason punishes the imagination, as Nick Land says himself here, for failing to be godlike, or rather, as Nick Land says himself, for failing to be in common with the character of the angels. What this really means is that this is the moment when reason punishes the imagination for being animal, or sauvage, or selvaggio. Now, later attempts to maybe domesticate this discovery of excess in art can be found in the tendency to transform beauty into something subordinate to something else. You have the idea that, well, beauty is really just a symbol of the moral ideal of the ethical life. And the ethical life is a, useful thing to bring up here, because ethical life is, in Kantian terms, rational in character, because it is precisely the purified categorical imperative which tells you what you are supposed to do. And the categorical imperative for Kant is pure only if it is drained of the kind of empirical contamination which your pathological drives would introduce as a certain excess which is beyond the well-regulated forms that had already been supplied within reason. For this reason, Nick Land notes that the first appearance of the unconscious in Western philosophy actually is not either that which you get with Freud talking about desire, drive, etc., nor is it even the idea of the noumenal subject. It is instead the intertwining of this pathology against ethical normativity, as well as the genius as the one who can't explain how he or she creates beautiful art, because even he or she doesn't actually know. Genius is therefore not a psychological character trait which one has in some interior sense. Rather, Nick Land tells us that genius deals with the outside because it's more like the onslaught of a raw energy from without than it is anything like something which one would rationally design in a fully conscious manner. Genius is therefore more like a disease, in the sense that one has aesthetic genius in the same way that one has syphilis. Now, in the second section of the text, Nick Land goes on to discuss a number of different ways that Schopenhauer revolutionized the philosophy of Kant, but the most important of these for our purposes was Schopenhauer's realization that when Kant talks about the noumenal, he's talking about something which is not only objective but also subjective, and also is talking about something for which we can say much more than simply the negative formula that the thing in itself is something of which all we can say is that we don't know anything about it, as Kant would claim. Rather, for Schopenhauer, we can say much more about the noumenal because we recognize it to be the will. And not just the will as a subjective faculty of a person, but rather the will as the inner essence of all things. Really, if you talk about the world not as the idea bound by the forms of space and time, but rather as this will, this is something which allows you to overturn a number of presuppositions inherent in the philosophy of Kant. For example, whereas Kant saw the will as being basically in line with reason, if you look at the second critique, one can will to do the good as disclosed in the ethical act, because reason is what discloses what you are supposed to do in the categorical imperative by giving you a purely abstract form of knowledge. Schopenhauer, in contrast, saw the will as being non-agentic, to use the term which Nick Land gives us in this text. This means that willing is not the willing of a rational subject, inevitably tending towards the rationally purified form of the ethical good. Instead, according to Schopenhauer, not only is willing pre-human, it is even pre-organic, in the sense that willing craving is what you find ultimately to be the essence of the entire world. Desire then is not just accidentally unconscious for Schopenhauer, it is fundamentally unconscious because the will might be incidentally objectified into body, of which the intellect, we must keep in mind, is just another organ. Genius, however, is not a feature which can be contained within limits of things like intellect and, by extension, body, because genius is instead the name for a certain surplus of will which goes beyond the functioning of the organism, conceived of as a natural totality. Genius is not an excess of the individualized will of one particular closed-off organism. Genius is instead the excess of pre-individualized will insofar as it is the essence of the universe. This is why it is always felt as a strange assault upon the individual and its own narrowly defined will. Likewise, Schopenhauer treated beauty very differently from Kant, largely viewing it negatively as that which happens when you renounce the pathology of interested thought and disengage from that to instead contemplate generalized species or types as universals which exist outside the representational limits of time and space. Bear in mind that the literal etymological meaning of interest is to be between. You might remember that in French the word entre is simply the word for between different things. So if one is interested, one is coming between different agents within the mundane world of spatial temporal representation. In contrast, the disinterested disclosure of the universal type of, say, a horse goes beyond any interested directedness towards particular horses here and now, and that disclosure of the universal form is beautiful precisely because it enacts a strange reversal in our attitude towards the mundane world of experience by revealing the latter to be the one which is really unreal. Because the representational idea caught up in space and time is, for Schopenhauer, Maya, or the Eastern word for a desubstantialized illusion, the beauty of the universal offers us an escape which ironically uses aesthetic illusion to free us from the more primordially given illusion which ordinary experience is ultimately revealed to be. Beauty is therefore a strange negation of negation. It's a second-order alienation from the alienation which the not-so-real world already was. However, Land notes that Schopenhauer's analysis of beauty is complicated, in that he also acknowledges a second kind, which is feminine beauty, and by implication, he acknowledges two different kinds of the sublime. Whereas the first of these is defined by the attitude of renunciation, the other is defined by the libido. The former is idealized abstraction away from the mundane world of space and time, while the latter is the excessively material illusion that desire can be directed to and can be satisfied in this world of human bodies in the all too literal sense of that term. The perfection of each of these, therefore, Nick Land claims, is something like a Deleuzian intensity, but each is of a different kind. For this reason, the aesthetic is, even for Schopenhauer, a flashpoint of accelerationism in which that intensity can be pushed to the point of a certain kind of singularity. Now, in the third section, Nick Land notes that Nietzsche continues a lot of the themes which he just directly learned from Schopenhauer himself, but Nietzsche's modifications were just as important, particularly the shift from Schopenhauer's talk of a will to life to instead talk of a will to power. We must briefly recall that Nietzsche had actually radicalized Kant's third critique by arguing that aesthetic truth is not simply one truth alongside the theoretical truth of, say, science or mathematics, and then the practical truth of ethics. No, aesthetic truth for Nietzsche really is the only truth, because you have a certain desubstantialization of what seem to be fixed givens, including values themselves, and that leaves you with nothing except the absurd stance of willfully creating your own values and then affirming them despite knowing full well that they are groundless. The only reason why you would affirm groundless values is that they are beautiful. Well, in Nietzsche's first major and most Schopenhauerian book, The Birth of Tragedy, The will is renamed Dionysus, who was, as you might recall, the god of drunken ecstasy within Greek mythology. For Nietzsche, Dionysus symbolizes the kind of art that you get with music. Schopenhauer also saw music as unique among all the art forms, in that its excessively abstract nature as something which is both pre-linguistic and also pre-imagistic actually makes it the most direct expression of the will as such. In contrast, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche identified Apollo with the kind of art you get with the Greek statue. This is a visual image which is fixed into a coherent and stabilized form. Tragedy, of course, is the art form which brings these two together, but the Dionysian can never really be reduced to the form of individualized coherence characteristic of the Apollonian. It can only ever seem to be so. One can only desire that that would be the case. Tragedy, therefore, represents the endpoint of Western openness to the outside, says Nick Land, and to the genuinely new. But Socrates closes this off once and for all by replacing the aesthetic truth of tragedy, which is still a form of art, with the kind of rationalist solipsism of the proto-Cartesian thinker stuck in the infinite loop of thinking its own redundant thoughts, which are redundant in the literal sense of being recollections of a priori forms seen between reincarnations in the world of ideas. One thing which changes when you transition from Kant to Nietzsche with regard to the aesthetic, which Nick Land himself does not bring up, but which I think is still significant, is that for Kant you have this acknowledgement that art is not universal in a conceptual sense, for that's precisely what defines it as an aesthetic experience rather than an ordinary kind of experience, but it is still felt to be universal, ultimately on grounds of the pseudo-universality of the human community. For Kant, you can only really explain this as though it were a universal structure inherent in experiences of beauty through appealing to the idea of taste. Anyone who is of good taste, we can all acknowledge, will be able to recognize that the music of Mozart is better than the music of Justin Bieber, that the storytelling of Honoré de Balzac is better than the storytelling of the clowns working in Hollywood, let alone the clowns working on Netflix. Once again, this is not universal in a conceptual sense, but is still felt to be universal on grounds of what Nietzsche would later call the human herd. Well, that's the big disagreement between the two. For Nietzsche, it's precisely the human herd which negates the greatness of the beautiful aesthetic form, because the kinds of values which can circulate easily among everyone within the herd are values which are not only weak and little, but they're also literally ugly. And it's not a coincidence that the weak and little thinkers within that community are also oftentimes literally ugly themselves. This is something which he accuses Socrates of demonstrating particularly well. So for Nietzsche, you have this understanding that all is will to power, but it's precisely because of this reduction of everything to the same kind of thing that you get more conflict, because will to power is not the stability of a fixed Aristotelian substance. It is rather a constant self-overcoming in which the exceptionally strong will to power, which is able to affirm things, even like the eternal return, with the full realization that even the worst moments of one's own life will have to be accepted to repeat not only once, but an infinite number of times. Well, the exceptionally rare will to power, which is strong enough to affirm, to say yes to that, is the same kind, really, that can affirm the beauty of its own values that it has created, with the full realization that these values are groundless. And precisely because of this sort of affirmative will to power is so rare, and because most of the herd is characterized by a very weak, reactionary, and nihilistic will to power, precisely for that reason, the beauty of the great aesthetic form is something which is no longer universally accessible. It's only accessible to the few. Interestingly, Nick Land closes his discussion of Nietzsche with a reference to an obscure passage from his unfinished magnum opus, the posthumously published work The Will to Power. The quote reads, "The effect of the work of art is to excite the state that creates art, intoxication." This revelation that the Dionysian frenzy is both something which must be presupposed in order for great art to exist, but is also something which one is led back into after one experiences the great form. One is led back into a type of Dionysian intoxication or frenzy. Well, this really does fit with the idea, as far as Kant is concerned, that the thing which accounts for art is a certain excess beyond that which is rational. Now, when you put this in modern terms, you find that this is just another way of saying that modern technology, as the worst form of rationalization for its own sake, is strictly antithetical to the great, beautiful form of the aesthetic, despite the fact that as modern technology develops, it inevitably turns its victims into smartphone zombies who come to eventually exist for no purpose except to be entertained. It's strange that art has completely disappeared from entertainment, even in a generation that is more obsessed with being entertained than any other in world history. But this really does make sense, because the arbitrariness of the beautiful form is just another way of saying, from a technical standpoint, that it is completely unpredictable. Modern technology, in contrast, turns entertainment into nothing more than a stimulus which can generate a predetermined response within its victim through having a fully predictable reaction to things like, say, sexual, violent, and other bodily stimuli. In the fourth section, Nick Land closes the essay by noting that Freud takes us beyond Nietzsche by turning the unconscious, paradoxically, into something which is contrary to the will. This is because, for Freud, the it is precisely the thing which makes the I do the things which the I does not will to do. However, by turning the unconscious into something which is the exact opposite of the will, Freud misses his own point by using this to reinterpret all art whatsoever as just so much repressed autobiographical musings about one's own past traumas in a disguised form. This is Freud's very worst bourgeois psychoanalytic regulation of the excess of genius, but is a predictable outcome of having the aesthetic shift from Nietzsche's groundlessly beautiful affirmation of self-valuation to instead the dismissal of art as always being secretly grounded in an Oedipal structure, which really is just a transcendent rationalization, which is always found one layer deeper, no matter how deep into the unconscious you might descend. This then is no longer affirmative, but is nihilistic, in the sense that the repressions of the superego and the pre-rational drive of the id always constrain one's movements, with no possibility of willing something like the groundlessly, unpredictably beautiful aesthetic value. This reaches its worst form when desire comes to actively desire its own repression. This is the transcendent ordering which becomes capital itself. But this shows you, through its antithesis to the genuinely beautiful form of the aesthetic, that art is indeed one of those accelerationist flashpoints in which you can intentionally accelerate the intensity of that power to collapse the illusory transcendent structures of capital.